And today we have a special session. So Catherine Vu, the Chief Uptime Officer, which I love that title, at Proactive IT, and Erica Carrasco, sounds like Tabasco, she told me, a lawyer at Field Law, have graciously offered to talk to us about cybersecurity. And we're going to learn the best practices for preventing cybersecurity attacks, especially in this age of working from home and all of the remote interconnection that we're doing, and also gain an understanding of the steps that should be taken when and if an attack occurs. And they're occurring. It's just a matter of whether we get to avoid it or it's somebody else that has it. But what to do when that happens. So Erica and Catherine, if you want to take it away and teach us all about cybersecurity.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, David. I'll start on a little bit about what cybersecurity is. And so as small and medium-sized businesses become increasingly dependent on services and application connected to the internet, we've also become a larger target for cyber criminals looking to exploit the vulnerabilities in our system. So every password we set, tool we use, and network we access leave us exposed and vulnerable to cyber threats. Most small businesses think that cyber attack won't happen to them because they are small, but according to a global cyber alliance, more than 43% of cyber attacks target small businesses because they often don't have the adequate security and technical expertise of a large organization. At Proactive IT, we have an up-close view of attacks that impact organizations. We've seen the frequency, severity, and sophistication of cyber attacks continue to grow. And while many of their attacks exploit misconfigured IT system and software vulnerability, a large amount of attacks happen because of human error. And my hope is that after this little webinar, you will include cybersecurity as part of your business health check every year, at least yearly.
Yeah, and I would definitely echo that, Catherine. We talk about health checks from a legal standpoint as well. I know that a lot of small businesses obviously are tight on cash, and certainly putting legal in your budget is sort of something that I don't think is commonly addressed. Oftentimes you'll have legal in your budget when you're considering some kind of step or transaction, but what I also hope that everyone takes away from today is that a line item budget in your, a line item in your budget should include legal, and it should include something like this as part of your legal health check as well. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, I will have convinced you that lawyers are not just there to, help when things have gone bad, but can help prevent and reduce your legal expenses just by being proactive.
Yeah, that was actually when David first kind of approached, when Kieran first approached this, I was like, huh, IT and legal, that's interesting. But then talking with you, I'm like, yes, that's like phenomenal to know. So I'm excited. So I'm gonna go into some common threats to businesses with cybersecurity are usually ransomware, malware attack. The bad actor encrypts and disables access to business critical systems and data until ransom payments paid. And data can be, it might be exfiltrated and exposed if a ransom isn't paid. Funds transfer fraud, we've seen a few of our clients fall for that. But a big problem is the business email compromise. Email intrusion resulting from spoofing, phishing, spear phishing that can result in data breach or fund transfer loss. If you don't know any of the word definition of any of the things that I'm talking about, please don't hesitate to ask. Sometimes you're sitting in a webinar and people say phrases, you're like, huh, what does that mean? So 54% of the point of entry of a cyber attack typically happens from email. So we'll go into some of those things that you can do to prevent it. But yeah, and with working from home, the risk are even higher, because in the old days, when we're all in the office, IT companies can protect the business by having like a security wall around the system. But now that we're all over in all remote services, the security has become more important than ever, because half the time the business are actually asking their staff to use their own internal PC workstation instead of even providing them with like a functional equipment to work from home, right? I mean, you try to save money because, you know, the pandemic kind of hit us, but now that that's kind of underway for the last 18, 20 months, we're having conversation with clients and saying, you know, please provide them with business equipment, because it will save you in the long run. So those are some of the risks that we see daily.
Yeah, and I think that with the pandemic, I'm sure you'll agree, Catherine, that this is a really good time to take a look at your cyber security, both from a hardware software perspective, as well as policies and procedures. So I guess that would bring us then to, you know, what can you do to be proactive before an incident occurs? And I think another misconception or myth out there is that it won't happen, you know, like you said, it won't happen to me. And the easy part of buying into that myth is it's almost impossible to know when someone has infiltrated your system. So once they're in, it's not like they start waving their hands around and, you know, letting you know they're in. They kind of sit there quietly, and they can sit there quietly for weeks, months, or even longer. Or, you know, they could be fishing and gathering information before they actually then go ahead and make the transaction that will harm you. So why it's really important to have policies and procedures is hopefully by using those checks and balances throughout the year, you might even be able to detect in advance of an incident that someone has infiltrated your system. So I know, Catherine, you'll be talking about how the hardware and software of your system impacts that. So why don't I turn over to you on that part, and then I can follow up why legal sort of fits into the policies and procedures.
Yeah, like for us, the most important kind of initial step that you can start is have an acceptable use policy with your staff. And that just by talking about it, it's on your top of mind, because I find that, you know, we are such busy people and we fly through the day. And that's usually when we're at the most risk, is that we do things too quickly and we don't know if our system are protected, because I mean, like I said, 54% of attacks come from email security. So make sure that your email is secure with antivirus filtering, and then have multi-factor authentication. I know that having multi-factor authentication is an extra step in doing the work, and it can be irritating if you forgot your password, especially if there's so many passwords for you to remember these days, and there are tools for that. But it's just the fact that we need to be cognizant of it, because I mean, even for me, when we installed Microsoft 365 3 or 4 years ago, I didn't have multi-factor on mine, and my email was compromised. And what they did was they kind of sidetrack, like what's the word I'm looking? They just kind of ignore my thing. So when I got the message that was like all my contact was attacked, and even contact that's not in my email somehow got attacked. And when my friends would respond, they had kind of moved my email to answering those things at the same time. And in 10 minutes, we caught it, because our friend actually called me and said, did you send it to me? I'm like, no. And that's a really good way of kind of addressing, if something just normally you don't get from someone, be aware, like your little spidey sense should be on right away. If you get something in your email and you know that I'm not expecting it, and there's an attachment or something like that, don't open it, press delete. But half the time, we're curious people. I mean, I have president calls me up and right after they click on an email, it's like, I know I shouldn't have clicked, but I was just too curious to wait for my staff to get back to me. And then at least they called and shut down their system right away, right? So curiosity sometimes is a big issue in this day. And then making sure you have good data backups, like not just one data backup, but multiple data backups. Because sometimes that's your only risk, defense against paying a ransom or anything like that. And then enable secure remote access. We used to do a lot of remote access before, and now we do more than ever. What kind of VPN do you have? What kind of security system do you put in place? Use the password manager. I use LastPass, but there are many out there that you can use. And what that prevent is from you to have to remember so many passwords or reusing the same password, because that's a risk. And then making sure that when you do have a password, that there is a lock after a certain attempt, because, you know, that's what, when you're getting attacked, it's not a person that's actually attacking you. It's bots that are just running it in the background. So they can just keep going until something stops them. So if you don't have any stopgap in terms of blocking them out, that could bring a risk to your company. And then also always scan for malicious software. Like Erica was saying, a lot of time it could be in your system for months before they decided they're going to attack. I mean, one time we had an incident happen to a client, and they were in their backup system for a whole month. And then they pressed delete, and the data was all gone. So thank God we have another backup, because otherwise there was nothing, because they deleted the backup itself. So that's the freaky part for me. It's not that you're getting attacked, it's that someone's watching you in the background. It's just creepy. And then something that's so simple that we should consider is implement a security awareness program with your staff. Talk about it. I think tell them there are testing companies out there, but you can just have a conversation first. So those are some of those things that that you can do to be proactive about your cybersecurity.
Yeah, and I think that also from a legal perspective, you might wonder, you know, why is a lawyer talking to me about this? At the end of the day, with everything that's become so common with these cyber incidents and with personal information being disclosed, is what we're now seeing is an elevated, and this is a legal term, duty or standard of care on businesses. So you can't just pretend that you didn't know about it. You can't say, well, we're a small business, we didn't know. Everyone now knows about phishing and cyber incidents, so you're expected to act reasonably. And so that's an evolving standard. So as we learn more and more, the standard of reasonableness increases. And so you are expected to train your staff and have the steps, hardware, software steps that Catherine talked about. You're also expected to have policies and procedures to deal not just with accessing your private device or corporate devices when you're at the office or remotely, but you're also supposed to have policies and procedures in place when a cyber incident occurs, what should happen next. And so that's the part that I don't think many businesses are aware of. When you find out that you might have an incident, what should you do first? I think a lot of businesses' first move is to call their own IT person or whoever deals with their IT, and they tend to just shut down the system, unplug it, turn it off, do a bunch of things. I would say to you that that's probably not your best bet unless you're a more sophisticated business who's had an incident before or who has done extensive planning and training. So why I say that is because in some cases your IT person and when I say IT people, again, there's a misconception that your internal IT team can handle any cyber incident, or that your internal people can handle any cyber incident. As part of that standard and duty of care that I just referred to, when you have a cyber incident, you want to remember you're going to be looked at externally and internally. So your employees and your staff are going to look to you to figure out what's going on, and your clients and customers are going to be impacted potentially in some way, shape, or form, or have questions. What you don't want to do is expose yourself to answering all of their questions and then suddenly have a lawsuit or some kind of breach on your hand for what you've told them that may not be accurate. So that's why you want to engage a lawyer and an forensic IT person before you even have a breach. You want to know who you're going to call if you think you have a breach. And what those people are going to do is the forensic IT person is going to help your IT team troubleshoot through what they should do immediately. And then your lawyer is going to make sure that everything you do after you think you have a breach is kept under solicitor-client privilege. So while you're investigating and determining what's happened and while you're responding. And that way, at the end of the day, when you look back and have to assess these issues, you don't have to disclose all of the steps that you took to every third party because it was in fact in contemplation of a potential litigation breach. So those are the immediate steps that you'll want to take. And without knowing who you want to engage as your forensic IT person and without knowing who the lawyer will be with that cyber experience, then you're going to be scrambling at the last minute, and you don't want to be doing that in the face of a breach. You want to know exactly who you need to call right away. The other thing that most people don't think about is if your system's down, you have no more contact information. So you don't have any key employee contact information or customer information. It's all gone. So again, Catherine talked about backup, but maybe sometimes that backup of those key people in an incident response needs to be in hard copy somewhere. So in an actual old school binder in the vault, or you have to go get it in case of an issue. And those are really important things, in addition to having a cybersecurity incident response plan and training, which can include mock exercises for your employees where they pretend, you pretend they're being phished, or you pretend to put a malware ransomware sign up on their computer and see if they actually do the right thing. So the other thing is the employees need to know who in the company they need to go to first. So they shouldn't be trying to figure it out themselves. They should immediately have one person, whether it's the CEO or the IT person or someone else that they go to when they think they've had an incident breach. And then it goes through the incident response team, which should include the lawyer, the forensic IT person, the CEO, and the IT person, and maybe even a PR person. So you have that team in place ahead of time. So those are some of those key pre-incident things that we recommend every business have in place, which isn't costly.
So Erica, why do you say that you would contact the lawyer first? I would think that maybe the IT person or whatever would be the first, but why do you recommend the lawyer?
Yeah, so that goes back to what I just mentioned about keeping everything under the cone of privilege and confidentiality. Because let's say you take certain steps that might have been not exactly correct or not exactly what someone else might deem reasonable. If they then ask you to produce all the steps you took after the incident response, you might have to give that over to a third party in the face of a lawsuit. But in today's day and age, we consider an incident response triggering potential litigation privilege. Once you've had an incident, you are exposed to a number of other potential lawsuits. So those could be lawsuits from your employees by divulging personal information. That could be lawsuits from your customers for divulging trade secrets. So the other thing that Catherine touched upon is data. It's really important to know what data you're collecting as a business, whether intentionally or secondary, and where that data is being stored. If you don't know that when you're breached or someone has infiltrated or exfiltrated data, you may not know what it is, and then you're really in their hands. When you know what it is, you might be able to determine, okay, it's not private, it's not trade secret, so we don't really care about it. We don't need to pay the ransomware attacker. And if you don't know, you don't have that benefit. But the other thing that can be harmed in these attacks is reputation. So right now there's a big shroud of shame around when you're, if you've been attacked, people seem to think it's their fault, that they didn't do enough. But I think that the bigger conversation in a community like this one is that you can't prevent this 100%. It's always a risk that's open and exposed to every business. And there's no shame if you're attacked, if you've taken reasonable steps to try and avoid it. And you need to share those experiences with one another because it helps people prevent it, from happening again and again. If you keep it undercover, then people don't learn about the different ways these threat actors, which is what we call them, are attacking. And so it's really important to share the information. And I think that brings us now into sort of breach response. When you have been breached, that you share that information with the RCMP. So, David, was there any other questions that you had about?
Well, just kind of, sort of, yeah, tying into that is, so if I've called you first, and that's a good first step to help in case, it's a third party liability or whatnot, does that mean that I continue to work through you through the whole process, or as long as I've contacted you first, then I can go and do the other things? Or if I do that directly, am I now also exposing myself to liability?
That's a really good question. So like all forms of litigation, it's the lawyer that needs to quarterback everything. And so while it sounds like a costly step to have a breach coach involved, and that's the name of the person that would help you through this. So either the breach coach will be appointed through your insurance company, or you can ask and select your breach coach, and either, if you have insurance or not, keep that breach coach. There's very few in Canada. And so I myself act as a breach coach, and there's a number of other lawyers throughout the country that are on the insurer's list to act as breach coaches. We fulfill a very specific role, and we are familiar with the steps in responding to various cyber incidents. We're also familiar with the team that needs to be engaged. So what we do is we quarterback it, and then everything sort of happens under that umbrella. But it's not that in that moment in time that legal work is occurring. So it is just to ensure all the proper steps are taken to minimize risk to you during the time that you're responding to the breach.
Okay, thanks.
And in my world, that doesn't usually happen for a little business, right? They'll just like, oh, I just can't get this file. Like it starts very innocently, right? Because you don't really actually know what happened until you get a call and it said, oh, I think I can't access this program or something. There's an X in it, like those are the kind of description I would get a call for. I'm like, uh-oh. And sometimes it could be just the simple fact that there's an X because their Office 365 is not syncing. Other time it's more serious, but just to do that simulation that Erica was talking about, and not even to have like if you're a small business of 5 people and you don't keep a lot of important data except for like contact lists, that's a different behavior than someone who who has like a huge multi-million-dollar business with hundreds of staff that they have to maintain. But it always starts really innocent, like, oh, what about this? But to do a simulation of what happened if we do get a breach, and then who are the people that are on the team to contact. So the fact that if you have that and something happens, you are more equipped to handle things that they go, and then you're not in panic, right? Like you've done it, you've kind of got a little practice at it. It's just like a fire drill, really. It's kind of getting to that point where even for us, like we're in IT, our risk is high too, like because we take care of our clients' stuff. And that's what keeps me up at night, right? Like, are we doing?
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, right. Like that's like, oh my gosh, people's data. That's my nightmare. But
well, imagine if you had a database of social insurance numbers and business numbers like an accounting firm.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Thank God. Catherine talked about if you don't have a lot of data, but one of my clients had that situation. They didn't have any private information and they didn't have any trade secrets. So they were inclined not to pay the ransomware or the ransom amount. And what the threat actor then did was attack their website and took it down completely, which meant that now their customers couldn't access the website, potential customers couldn't place orders or access the website. So in that sense, they created enough of a nuisance that we had to pay the ransomware amount. So, they call it like a double threat approach. It's not just that they're threatening to, lock up and exfiltrate data. They're going to actually threaten to interrupt your business and to harm your reputation regardless. And so that's something to why you want to be vigilant. You just don't want to be in that situation. And yeah, it is a nuisance more so than something you should be ashamed of or anything like that. And it will in the end cost money one way or another to either put up a new website or pay them. So that's the other thing to really consider.
And sometimes you can pay them in the dark web and you can get the data back anyways. So that's not a guarantee either. So it's just, I know this sounds kind of like a scare tactic, but it's more just awareness, like what are your risks and what can we do to, and it's as simple as reviewing your behavior and attitude on internet access, like daily. Just kind of have that in the back of your mind. If you can teach your employee to have that kind of questioning, should I be doing this? And anytime you have that, should I be doing it? That's when you should pause and take a moment and make sure you make the right choice. Because usually if that's happening, something is not right. You know it intuitively because you use enough you've been enough of an IT user to kind of be aware when something doesn't look right or seems right,
This might not be the best approach. I forward every email I'm not sure about, I forward to my IT department. I'm like, is this what I think it is? And they probably think, oh my God, Erica, stop flooding our inbox.
But you know what? It's getting so realistic. Like I get a lot of Office 365, very legitimate looking stuff. And I press it to my consultant and they're always telling me, yep, it's one of those. But half the time you just don't know, right? And so it's just to be that cautious awareness, review your behavior, that kind of stuff.
And I think you touched on a really important thing when you mentioned that sometimes you can pay the ransomware on the dark web and you still don't get your files back. I think one of the really important things that you will notice in having a team ahead of time is that someone like myself as a breach coach, I would help you engage a ransomware negotiator. And these are people that have constant access to these threat actors, that they have rated them. So when my client, for example, has a ransomware attack, they can go in once they know what the malware was, they know who the threat actor is, and they know they have a rating, whether they out of 5, whether once they're paid, they do what they say. And if their rating is below a 3, they recommend not paying them. So there's lots of reasons why you engage experts on this, because there are people that really do know this inside and out. You should not be trying to go onto the dark web yourself. I do not recommend it. So if you get that ransomware sort of message and it says go to this address, please do not do that. I don't think that you will want to be trying to navigate the dark web. There's really weird things that these threat actors do. Some only work on evenings and weekends. Some, if you don't reply right away, get upset. They have some very interesting behavior that each of the ransomware experts know who they are and how to respond appropriately to them, whether to play hardball or not. It's just not the same kind of negotiation that you would imagine. It's pretty much like a hostage negotiator.
Sounds like it.
Yeah. So it's not something you should try and do on your own.
For sure.
Unless you want to
clarify. Sorry, go ahead, Catherine.
I said, unless you want to be cool. I went into the dark web today.
Yeah. And just to clarify, for kind of cemented in my head, the risk area, or what we're talking about, is more like your server and what's in-house, right? Like if I've got, because we have a bit of a hybrid, I'd say about half of our software and programs and data are on cloud-based, in cloud-based programs. And then we've got another, half or so that are probably within our server environment. When we're talking about this stuff, is my cloud-based stuff fairly well protected, or is it also at risk?
It's also at risk. And that's the misconception, is that if you're in the cloud, you're more secure. Yes, typically, Microsoft has way more resource thrown into their security than you would.
Yeah.
But do you know that Microsoft, if you have your data in Microsoft, and they don't guarantee anything. Like if you lose your data in 30 days, that's too bad, right? So there should be a backup to that. Or in our case, we use a cloud solution for our ERP system. So the question you should ask your ERP provider is, what happened if you get an attack? How do I get my data? So those are just questions that you need to know and then be comfortable with their answer. Yes, convenient. Like I love to say this, convenient and security are on opposite end of the scale, right? So if it's too convenient, is it secure? You know, like those are kind of the question that you should ask. But it's always good when you're considering a cloud provider is to ask them what their security policy is and what happened if they get a hack, because chances are they're more targeted for an attack than you would be.
Right, right.
And Catherine, that's such a good point. We didn't even discuss it in our outline. Another thing we always say as part of our pre-preparedness, if that's even a word, is to look at those contracts that you do have, because a lot of small businesses or medium-sized businesses have to outsource that. And when you look at a lot of those contracts, those third-party providers who are storing your data wash their hands of any liability, which means that it still comes back to you. And you have to have made yourself aware of what they are doing to protect your client's data and your data. So that's a really, really good point, is like simply just by outsourcing where you store your data doesn't help alleviate this risk. But yeah, I think that does sort of tie into, we've covered a lot about breach response now at this point. I think, David, that, right when a breach occurs, that people should call those key people and engage that team. Was there anything else from the breach response that we haven't discussed yet?
This doesn't necessarily go to that, but it is sort of still related. Colin was wondering more just, I guess, how it happened, but his people started to send out, or these cyber threats started to send out emails directly from his contacts. He was wondering how that actually happens. Like, what did they do to get there? And then he ended up changing his password, catching it, and that kind of thing. But what else could he have done to catch that?
That's really, well, that means that your email password was compromised. And that's what was happened to me, because I didn't have multi-factor authentication. And you can do that by having a text to your phone or use an authenticator app. And the app is definitely more secure because it's more convenient to get a text to your email, to your phone, than it is with the app. Because I don't know, when the clock is going 25, 26, it counts down, like I always get nervous that I don't have enough time to key in, and then I get all flustered.
So you got to remember that 6-digit number.
Yeah, exactly. So I always like the text part, but then there's a risk if they circumvent your email somehow, your phone, then that could happen too, right? So, but that just means your email password was compromised. And if you're like most people, if your email password is compromised, you should change password to everything, really, because sometimes you use that same password. Anywhere you use the same password, you should change it. And typically, do you remember in the old days, we used to get an email that says, I know your password to this email. And it's because you've gone to a website that has a collection in the background of how you log in. But most websites aren't very secure, especially if it's like where free stuff is downloaded. That's where all the bad people are hanging out, right? But you just so don't either have a different email address or don't use the same password as your email, would be how I would kind of recommend to overcome some of those things. Because it's usually your email get compromised because accessing it from a website that doesn't have as much security.
Yeah, and I'd probably add to that that you would, in a case like that, definitely is an example of where you'd want to report that to that key person that's been identified as the keeper of all things cyber, and you'd want to let them know that in fact you'd had a breach.
I'll let mom know that I picked you up.
And again, I think that comes down to really emphasizing to employees and people that you're working with as partners that it's not a shameful thing. It's something that you need to share and share quickly, because other things could be happening that could be preventable if someone were to know and be able to catch it. So changing your password and then just hoping for the best is probably not advisable.
Okay. And there was another question from Kurian actually about, and more, I guess, Catherine, probably for you, about what services or our software would you recommend that can basically rewind your hard drive back to a time that wasn't compromised? What's the best for that, or is there good software for that?
Oh yeah, like I can see that the Dropbox. Yeah, Dropbox is pretty good if that's all your stuff is in there. But sometimes you don't know when it happened. So then it's hard to know when, and if they only have a 30-day policy to rewind your data back, and a file that you don't use, but maybe once every year, and you didn't know that was part of it, then that's not going to be a sufficient solution for you in a rewind software. Like if you catch it, yeah, then that's typically okay. But sometimes you don't know for a while, right, until it happens, and then you don't actually know until you actually go to use the files. So we always say Dropbox is good, but have more than one solution. So have an on-site solution, an off-site solution, so at least you have two, or at minimum two, and then multiple, even if your data is very important to you.
Yeah, and I think that's where Catherine really comes into play, and I would rely upon my clients and recommend to them they have someone like Catherine to make sure their backup systems are as good as they can be. That's really saved a lot of my clients from worrying about business interruption, is having that backup system so they can at least continue operating while we're investigating and responding to the breach. And again, like that has made a world of difference to my clients, is having me quarterback and manage the breach while they can carry on with business in an amazingly stressful time. Because I can tell you that when these threat actors are going, it's 24 hours a day. So I'm awake all around the clock. As a business owner and someone running the business, you don't need to be awake around the clock. You need to be able to be responding to your customers and your clients. And that's the other part of incident response that becomes why you need your own wherewithal, is you are going to have to manage that communication internally with your employees, keep them calm, make sure they know what they can share and not share with customers, with their family and friends. I can tell you that we've had employees post on social media that they are being breached. They're like, look at what happened to my computer today. That is absolutely what you want to make sure that your employees know not to do. It's amazing. Like, it's all about the awareness, like Catherine said, but without drilling that into your employees' sort of habits, it's so easy to revert to just the regular, like, oh, look at what's happening in my day, I'm going to share that with everyone I know, because that's currently what people are doing. That they keep things confidential, that they have a messaging to respond to client or customer inquiries. So FAQs get built out right away for us to disseminate to the key people that are going to communicate. And those are sometimes things we don't think about. But again, sometimes you have to put out a public statement if the website's down, and me assisting with that is really important, because you don't want to say certain pieces of information. There's certain things you want to disclose, or certain words you want to use. You want to make sure you're not exposing yourself to more inquiries and more problems. So that's that's another area that sometimes isn't thought of, or that people think they know what they want to say, I even had a client who wanted to disclose to all of their key contractors that they'd been breached out of transparency. And until I explained to them what their obligations were and why they might not want to do that, then they kind of stepped back and decided they'd wait. And in the end, they didn't need to disclose. There was nothing that happened that interrupted the business or threatened their customer relationships. So that's something to consider. Another thing that I don't think people might think about is looking at your own third-party agreements with your customers. If you have big name customers, even if you're a small business, like an ATCO or a government entity, they have breach response requirements over and above any legislative requirements, and we haven't really touched on that, but I'm sure you're all familiar with our privacy statutes, both federally and provincially. So depending on if you're a public body, then you're under a different obligation as a private entity. If you disclose private information under the Provincial Act, you have an obligation to report to certain individuals as well as the Privacy Commissioner. So those are things that you also need to involve a lawyer in that analysis, but you also might have obligations, contractual obligations. You might want your lawyer to take a quick look at and see whether you need to report to anyone else. So it can get very complicated.
Mm-hmm. So you've touched on this a response plan a couple of times. Where do you recommend maybe multiple copies of that be kept?
Well, definitely, you should keep that together in that binder with your contact information. And then every key person on your team should have a copy of that response plan and should be very familiar with it. Your employees would probably have a different type of response plan policy that they should have available to them. So there might be different levels of it, a more general policy and procedure for everyone versus the more specific breach response for the key players, which would include having your vendor contracts already vetted and approved. And that's why I think Catherine talked about looking at this on an annual basis, because probably, within a year, maybe you want to change your vendor. You found a new IT person that you work really well with, and maybe there's a new IT person you want to bring on to the team, or maybe you've got a new breach coach. I can't imagine how you find someone better than me. No, just kidding. But you might find different people on your team might change, and so that's why you want to maybe take a new look or make sure that the vendor agreement hasn't changed with that particular third party. Because again, when a breach occurs, you don't have time to look at a lawyer's retainer letter or Catherine's scope of work policy. You want to be kind of familiar with it before the breach occurs, and her hourly rate and my hourly rate, so that you know what you're kind of looking at before you dive into it. And I think there was a couple of questions I noticed on the chat, David.
Yep. Actually, Ray just posted one that's very, on what you were just talking about. He's just saying, is there a rough budget amount that one should consider to start with before, a further look?
Strictly probably from a legal perspective, we kind of have the small, medium to like executive level of cyber planning that you can do. So the very bare minimum of just, having a plan and a basic plan and policy, I would say shouldn't exceed $2,500 for just like putting something in place from legal. But when you get beyond that and you start looking and auditing your systems and procedures, then you can go from like 5 to 10. And a gap assessment, I can tell you, is about 10 to 15 grand minimum. And a gap assessment is something that maybe like Catherine would do or a forensic IT person would do, where they'd come in and they'd look at your IT systems and how they interact with your policies and procedures and tell you where your vulnerabilities lie from that kind of standpoint. And you'll see that often thrown out there for people to offer. And there's more and more partners that we're working with that offer it now at a more discounted rate. So there was a lot of players out there like charging an arm and a leg for that early days. But when you work with people that do this frequently, you can get better rates and better partners that will be able to tailor it to your business's needs, because not everyone needs a $15,000 or $20,000 gap assessment.
Right.
But that would be like the Cadillac of cybersecurity that we would recommend people, doing, big dollar revenue, and you know, it kind of goes proportionate, I would say, to your revenue.
Yeah,
and
size of your business and stuff.
sensitivity of your data. Yeah.
Yeah. And it doesn't sound like it is that expensive to get started and to at least get a good, a good start in place, right? Something.
And the other thing also is to watch for your insurance policy, because we have a lot of clients that think they're insured for cybersecurity, but it's just a little rider that really protects them from very little things or pay for very little support for you. Like it'll send out notification to your customer if you've been breached, like all of that, but not the cost to get you up and going, even for your network, or if your server goes down, or if you lost your data and you have to do ransom. Like there's so many different policy now, and I think just to have that in your head, that when you're renewing your insurance policy and there's a cybersecurity clause in there, ask particularly, what am I protected from? What am I covered? And then if that's not enough for you, pay for more. It's worth it. And that's the whole thing of insurance, right? You don't pay for it because you want it. You pay for it when you don't need it, and for when you do need it, right? So that's just something that I've been really cognizant to talk to my clients about, because they think that, it can be quite costly just for us to help you get your files, or depending on your size of business, whether or not you can be down. If you can't be down and you need to be up like right away after an attack, then you want to make sure your backup capability allows for that. And if you have that covered in insurance, then that's a lot better for you to cover the breach coach and all of that, right?
And typically, they will cover the cost of the breach coach. That's usually not one that's questioned, but I think an important thing for that, you need to know as a business owner or running a business, is that it doesn't always cover social engineering and phishing. And sometimes they will want you to pay for all of the vendor costs up front, and then they would review and vet them and reimburse you. So some are reimbursement policies, and that's a big upfront expenditure. So when the breach occurred for one of my clients, and this was one where it was not very sensitive data, but they needed to get their website up and running, I would say that their costs were upfront about 40 grand. So that included paying the ransomware, paying legal, paying the forensic IT, paying the ransom expert negotiator, plus getting another IT expert to actually build back up their system. So that I would say was on the low end. Then another client that had far more involved ransomware attack was closer to 100 grand, and they had business interruption losses of in excess of 150 grand. So some of that was covered and some of it wasn't. And so it's really important to understand what kind of coverage you have and how you're going to budget. So when I talked about budget, you might actually even need a line item in your budget for paying for some of that stuff, which includes not just the legal, so some of the other expenditures. Right.
Oh, for sure.
So there's a question about how to implement two-factor authentication within a company. So if your employee are uncomfortable using their phones, they can still have the app. The authenticator app is a lot more secure, and especially, well, we cover some seniors home, and they have multiple staff using the same device, so it's harder for them to have multi-factor authentication. So it's just a challenge, but you have to kind of talk about it. And like, if they don't want to use their cell phone, then there's very limited thing that you can do. But using a cell phone as a response is a lot different than using just the app, because there's other app that you use, because you can use Microsoft Office app on your phone too, right? Like, so it's having that, or give your employee their own business phone. I know that might sound like extreme, but the best protection for you is having business devices, business phones, because your staff is your number one line of defense, but they're also your number one risk on a cyber attack. So just think about that every time you have an expenses that you're trying to save. Is it what is the implication to your business if you go the cost-effective way.
Yeah. Well, and I'll throw a teaser out there that's sort of an HR related area for sure and question. And maybe in the next session or two, we'll have an HR specialist talk about things like that, if we knew one. Hey, Sarah?
I see that.
I said, I don't know anyone.
Yeah.
Since I've unmuted, one thing that has occurred, and I thought I'd just bring it up really quickly, is I've had a few clients contacting me. Their payroll was breached, and how it was breached was internally, they get an email, and the email looks exactly like how it should. And it says, hey, my banking information has changed. Here's my new banking information. And funny enough, one of them was the CEO sent the email to the payroll person, and the CEO happens to sit in an office right beside her. So she changed the banking info. And then as she was going to the coffee place, she said, so you changed banks? And he went, no. And she went, oh my God. He went running back and realized. Wow. So what was scary though, is as they went through it, is how it matched so perfectly to what she gets from him all the time. So that's one to be aware of. And what we ended up talking about from an HR perspective is, as you guys were alluding to earlier, the employee feels shame about bringing it forward. And in particular, your payroll team, quite often, you know, they're so concerned about making everything perfect. So letting them know that it's an error, it's okay, bring it forward ASAP, we'll get it fixed. So don't sit on it. But you think about how long it takes sometimes for payroll, because when would they have noticed was when he missed his payment, right?
Right.
So they might not have noticed for a full month. And
well,
then
that's the thing, it's the challenge of spear phishing, right? Like,
yeah,
where HR people would get resumes, and of course they're going to click, that's their job. So that's how they get in. So it's very sophisticated. And so if you didn't have a job that you're posting for, and you all of a sudden get a post whack of resumes, it just be careful. And we had that they had someone attack them and send to their vendor a new way to get paid. So they weren't getting any of the payments because it was So that
we had so I have a claim like that right now, where the client was phished the same way. They like replicated the payment email the same way, so they followed that and paid this rogue party instead of the proper party, and we are now suing that party because their systems were not safe enough for payment. So what we're saying is that was an improper way of us having to give you payment. There should have been a way where we confirmed with you by phone when we got that email that you didn't have in place to make sure that you got paid. And now we're out hundreds and thousands of dollars because we paid someone else instead of you. And we have potential claims against us. Now, I can tell you this is one of the more novel ways of making a claim against someone, because there are two different standards of care being used, one in the US and one in BC. And so we're gonna see which one the Alberta courts follow, and whether or not, you know, this other party will be held to a higher standard for having established these payment processes that were not safe. So I think it was Sarah talking that when, you know, someone calls or someone sends you an email, you pick up the phone and you verbally use their contact information to double check that they've said that, because there's even voice phishing now. So people can call you and replicate someone's voice and do that through digital means, and you think it's the person that is supposed to be calling you to tell you something. So you always have to do it two ways, one in and one out.
Easy. Well, we only got a couple of minutes left. I don't know, Samantha, if you're still on, can you post, or Catherine and Erica, if you want to just post your emails maybe into the chat box, so that if people have any further questions or want to contact you, they know how to do so. But if you lose that or don't have that, I mean, don't forget Catherine's at Proactive IT, and Erica is a lawyer at Field Law. So, all right. Well, thanks for today. That was scary but informative. It was. I mean, honestly, it is a little scary. Or a lot scary. That's for sure. But you know what? If you've helped protect us or teach us new things that we can do to reduce our risk, it's been certainly more than worth it. So I appreciate the time that you two have put in to do this.